It was a cool and cloudy morning in London. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd had gathered. Tourists from all over the world were standing behind the black iron fence, holding cameras and phones, waiting to see the famous changing of the guard. Among them was Captain Jake Thompson, an American Army officer visiting the city for the first time. Jake was tall, confident, and full of energy. He had seen many things in his military career, but today, he was curious about something different. He'd had heard stories about the Queen's Guards, the men in red coats and tall black hats who stood perfectly still no matter what. Some people said they never moved, even if someone shouted in their face. Jake smiled to himself. They can't be that serious, he said to his friend Dan, who was standing beside him. Dan chuckled. They're trained not to react, but don't mess with them too much. I heard they have strict rules. Jake shrugged. I just want to see if it's real. As the royal guards took their positions, the crowd went quiet. People raised their phones and started recording. The guards marched with sharp, clean steps and perfect timing. They didn't look left or right. They didn't blink. They looked like statues come to life. Jake was impressed, but he still wanted to test it for himself. He stepped closer to the rope that separated the public from the guards. Slowly, he leaned forward and waved his hand near the guard's face. Nothing happened. The guard didn't move. His eyes stared straight ahead, like he didn't even see Jake. Jake laughed softly. Wow, they really are like robots. Some people nearby gave him nervous glances. One woman shook her head. He shouldn't do that, she whispered to her friend. Dan gave Jake a nudge. Come on, man. You've seen it. Let's not cause a scene. But Jake wasn't done. He made a silly face, trying to get a reaction. He spoke in a fake British voice, just loud enough for the guard to hear. Good day, sir. Fine weather for a stand, isn't it? Still, nothing. The guard didn't move an inch. Jake raised an eyebrow, more curious than ever. They're good, he said quietly. But maybe they're just told to ignore us. I wonder if they'd move if I got really close. He looked down at the ground and noticed a thin white line painted just in front of the guards. He had heard somewhere that crossing that line was a big mistake. Jake thought about it for a moment. His friend's warning echoed in his mind. But he was still tempted. The challenge was just too interesting. He took a small step forward, his boot landing just past the white line. That's when everything changed. The moment Jake's foot crossed the thin white line, he felt a small rush of excitement. He was standing closer to the royal guard now, just inches away from the tall, still figure. The guard's red coat and black hat were impressive up close. Jake could see the small details, each button on the coat, the polished boots, and the rifle carefully held in place. But as he looked into the guard's eyes, he saw nothing but a cold, hard focus. Jake stepped back slightly and turned to his friends, whispering, Look at this. These guys are like robots. They don't even notice anyone around them. Don't do it, Jake, Dan said, his voice worried. You're really pushing it now. But Jake didn't listen. He was convinced that the guard wouldn't react no matter what he did. After all, it was just a little fun, wasn't it? With a grin, he stepped even closer to the guard. He was almost daring the soldier to do something, anything. He made a loud noise, clapped his hands right in front of the guard's face, and even waved his arms around like a windmill. Still, the guard remained perfectly still. Jake laughed quietly, feeling a little proud of himself. See, nothing. As the crowd around him continued to watch in silence, Jake couldn't help himself. He had to take it one step further. Maybe the guard was only pretending to be unmoved. Maybe if Jake got even closer, closer than anyone else ever had, he could break that stoic expression. The thought filled Jake with a sense of challenge. After all, he was used to soldiers with discipline, but this was something else. He walked another step forward, now just a foot away from the guard. He looked at the rifle that was still held firmly in the guard's hands. It was impressive, the way the soldier stood so tall and strong, as if nothing in the world could make him break his composure. Jake tilted his head and waved his hand right in front of the guard's face again. But this time, he didn't just wave. He shook his hand wildly, hoping to get some kind of response. But the guard didn't budge, not even a tiny shift in posture. Jake blinked, impressed but confused. Was this some kind of trick? How could someone stand so still for so long without blinking, without even showing the tiniest sign of emotion? Just as Jake was about to take another step forward, something happened that stopped him dead in his tracks. Without warning, the guard took one precise step forward. His boots slammed against the ground with a force that seemed to shake the air around them. Jake froze. The guard's eyes, though still focused forward, seemed to glow with quiet authority. In an instant, the air around Jake grew heavy. The people in the crowd seemed to lean forward in anticipation. "Step back," the guard commanded in a deep, calm voice that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Jake swallowed hard, realizing in that moment that this wasn't a joke anymore. The guard's presence was nothing like Jake had expected. This wasn't some show. This was real. Jake slowly took a step back, feeling a mix of embarrassment and awe. The crowd around him murmured in surprise, but Jake didn't care. His mind was still trying to process what had just happened. He crossed a line, and the guard had made sure he knew it. Jake stood there, his feet frozen on the ground, trying to shake off the shock that had washed over him. The guard had stepped forward so suddenly, and his voice had been so firm, Jake felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It was as if the world had shifted, and suddenly, he wasn't the confident officer he had been a few moments ago. He was just another person in front of someone with complete control. He glanced around at the crowd. People were still staring, some of them filming on their phones, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Dan, standing a few feet away, gave Jake a quick, worried glance before whispering, "Man, you really did it now." Jake didn't say anything. His pride was bruised, but something else was happening too. As the moments passed, he started to feel a deep respect for the guard. It wasn't just about standing still. There was something about the guard's presence, his silence, his posture, his eyes, that made Jake realize how serious this moment was. The royal guard wasn't just standing still. He was guarding something more than just the palace. He was guarding a tradition, a history, and a level of discipline that Jake had never really understood before. It wasn't just about ignoring distractions. It was about keeping a promise, maintaining focus no matter the situation. For the first time, Jake felt like he was the one who had made a mistake. He had underestimated the power of discipline, the power of stillness. He had expected the guard to break, to lose his composure, but the only one who had been shaken was him. He wasn't even angry, Jake muttered to himself. He didn't need to shout or anything. Just one step forward, and I knew I'd crossed the line. The guard didn't react to Jake's words, of course. He remained standing, tall and proud, eyes still fixed ahead. There was no emotion in his expression, no sense of pride or anger, just the quiet determination that came with years of training. Jake was starting to realize that this wasn't about a single moment of control. It was a lifestyle, a way of being that went far beyond what he had imagined. As the seconds ticked by, Jake took a few steps back, his face now serious. He wasn't laughing anymore. He wasn't joking. He was reflecting, taking in everything he had just experienced. This wasn't a game. This was real, and he had just learned a valuable lesson. The crowd around him began to settle, the moment slowly fading back into the usual bustle of tourists. Jake's friends nudged him, some still chuckling, while others gave him a look of concern. But Jake wasn't thinking about that. He was still focused on the guard. He finally took a deep breath and said, "You know what, Dan? That guy wasn't just doing his job. He was teaching me something." Dan raised an eyebrow. "Teaching you? About what?" "About discipline," Jake said quietly, looking over at the guard. "About knowing when to stand tall, when to stay silent, and when to let your presence speak louder than words." For the first time that day, Jake felt like he understood what the Royal Guard was really about. It wasn't about showing off or seeking attention. It was about something much deeper, something that Jake now realized he had a lot to learn from. Jake stood there, a few steps back from the Royal Guard, still processing what had just happened. The crowd had started to settle down, but his mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the guard had moved, how one small step forward, one firm motion, had made everything change. It was a quiet power, a power that didn't need to shout or make a scene. It was just there, calm and strong. He glanced over at his friends. Some were still whispering, amused by Jake's boldness, while others were quieter, sensing the change in the air. Jake, however, was too lost in thought to pay much attention to them. His eyes kept drifting back to the guard, who still stood motionless, as if nothing in the world could shake him. "Man, you okay?" Dan asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the guard's face. There was something about the soldier's stare that seemed to cut through him, something that made Jake feel like he was being seen in a way he wasn't used to. Not in a judgmental way, but in a way that made him realize just how much he had underestimated the situation. The guard's eyes didn't move, but they seemed to carry a message. It wasn't just about the duty of standing still. It was about the understanding that everything had a place, a time, and a purpose. Jake felt small in comparison. He was used to leading soldiers, but this was different. This man, standing so still, had a presence that commanded respect in a way Jake had never experienced. He shook his head, trying to push away the feelings of humility that were settling in. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, though his voice didn't sound as confident as usual. "You sure?" Dan pressed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I haven't seen a ghost, but I've definitely learned something today." "Yeah." Dan raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Discipline," Jake said quietly, his eyes still on the guard. "I thought I understood what discipline was, but I was wrong. I didn't know what it really meant until now." Dan looked at him, confused. "Discipline? From the guard?" "Yeah," Jake nodded, his voice full of respect. "It's not just about following orders or doing what you're told. It's about staying focused, staying calm, and knowing when to stand your ground. This guard didn't shout at me, didn't make a scene. He just stood his ground, and I could feel it." The more Jake thought about it, the clearer it became. He had spent his life thinking that leadership was about loud commands and strong action. But this soldier, without a single word, had shown him something else, something deeper. He glanced once more at the guard, who hadn't moved an inch since that one powerful step forward. The guard's posture was still perfect, his expression as unreadable as ever. Yet, Jake felt like he had just witnessed a lesson in strength that words could never explain. As the moment stretched on, Jake realized that this experience was one he would carry with him forever. It wasn't just a funny story to tell back home. It was a true lesson in the power of presence and discipline, something that Jake would never forget. The hours after the encounter with the Royal Guard were a blur for Jake. As he and his friends left Buckingham Palace and wandered through the streets of London, his mind was still stuck on the events that had just unfolded. He couldn't help but replay the scene over and over in his head. The guard's movement, the command to step back, and that stillness that seemed to hold the power of the entire palace within it. They visited a few more landmarks that afternoon, but Jake wasn't really present. While his friends admired the views and took pictures, Jake's thoughts were elsewhere. His mind kept drifting back to the guard. It wasn't just about the moment of tension. It was about what the guard had represented. The stillness wasn't just about standing in one place. It was about the discipline to maintain control over everything around you, even when the world around you was chaotic. That evening, back in his hotel room, Jake sat down with his journal. He had never been much for writing, but today he felt like he needed to reflect on what he had learned. The words flowed easily onto the pages, almost as if his hand were moving on its own. Today, I learned something important. I thought I understood discipline, but I was wrong. Real discipline isn't about making noise or showing off. It's about quiet strength. It's about knowing when to act and when to be still. The guard didn't react when I made a fool of myself. He didn't shout at me. He simply stood his ground. That was the lesson. As Jake wrote, he could almost feel the weight of the guard's presence again. He remembered the calm authority in the soldier's eyes and the way the air had seemed to shift with that one firm step forward. Jake had faced soldiers in combat, trained men who were tough and fearless, but none of them had shown him the kind of calm, quiet discipline that the Royal Guard had demonstrated. He closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, staring out the window at the city lights. For the first time in a long time, he felt a deep sense of humility. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his own understanding of discipline. But now, he saw that there was always more to learn. The guard had taught him something that no military training ever could. It wasn't about toughness. It was about control. I can learn from this, Jake whispered to himself. He felt like he had just unlocked a new level of understanding. Maybe it was the kind of lesson that only came when you were truly ready to listen. The next day, as he boarded the plane back to the United States, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the guard. He had spent so much time leading with his voice, commanding others, trying to show his authority. But the Royal Guard had shown him a different way. A way of leadership that didn't need to shout. A way that commanded respect simply through action. As the plane soared into the sky, Jake knew that when he returned to his base, he would carry that lesson with him. He would lead differently now, not by being the loudest in the room, but by being the calmest, the most disciplined, and the most focused. And that, Jake realized, was what true strength was all about. The flight back to the United States felt longer than Jake had expected. Perhaps it was because he couldn't stop thinking about the Royal Guard and the lesson he had learned in London. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the soldier standing perfectly still, his presence commanding respect without a single word. Jake was eager to return to his base, but he also knew he had changed somehow. Something inside him had shifted, and he wasn't sure how it would affect his leadership. When Jake finally arrived home, he was greeted by familiar faces, his colleagues, soldiers, and friends. But even though they were excited to see him, Jake felt a quiet sense of distance. Everything seemed normal on the surface, but inside, he felt different. He wasn't sure how to explain it, but he knew the change had happened the moment he crossed that white line in front of the Royal Guard. The first few days back at base were a blur of meetings, reports, and training. Jake went through the motions, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was seeing things differently. He was still the same officer, still the same leader, but now he understood that leadership wasn't just about giving orders. It was about the ability to stay calm, to remain focused, and to lead by example, just like the guard had done. One morning, as Jake stood in front of a group of soldiers, he noticed a small tension in the air. They were preparing for a drill, and some of the men were rushing, not fully paying attention to the details. Normally, Jake would have raised his voice, reminded them to focus, maybe even pushed them harder to get their act together. But this time, something inside him told him to take a different approach. He cleared his throat, took a deep breath, and spoke calmly. "Let's slow down," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Focus on the details. No rushing. We're not in a hurry. We're here to do it right." The soldiers looked up, surprised by his change in tone. Jake wasn't shouting. He wasn't demanding perfection. He was simply asking them to stay focused, to take their time, and to give their best effort. Something in his voice was different. There was no tension, no impatience, just calm authority. The soldiers straightened up, and the tension in the air seemed to ease. They nodded and began to follow his instructions more carefully. Jake could see the difference in their movements. They weren't just rushing to finish the drill. They were taking the time to do it properly, with precision and care. Jake felt a small sense of pride, but more than that, He felt relief. The shift in his approach had worked. Later that day, as Jake reflected on the drill, he realized something important. The lesson he had learned from the Royal Guard wasn't just about discipline. It was about leading through quiet strength. By staying calm and focused, he had shown his soldiers what real leadership looked like. They didn't need him to shout or demand their attention. They needed him to set the example and stay composed, just like the guard who had stood still without flinching. Jake smiled to himself, knowing that he had finally found a new way to lead. The lessons from London had taught him more than he ever expected, and now he was ready to lead with a new kind of strength, one that was calm, focused, and disciplined. Weeks passed since Jake's return from London, and the changes in him had become more noticeable. His leadership style had shifted, and his soldiers were beginning to respond to it in a way he hadn't expected. The more he led with calm and focus, the more his team seemed to trust him. They looked at him differently, as if they could feel the shift in his presence. Jake wasn't trying to be someone else. He was simply being more like the Royal Guard, the kind of leader who inspired respect without needing to shout. One afternoon during a routine training session, Jake stood back and observed his soldiers as they worked. The drill was simple, something they had done countless times before. Normally, Jake would have walked around giving tips, making corrections, and offering instructions. But today, he chose to stay where he was, standing quietly in the corner of the field. He wasn't giving orders or talking much at all. The soldiers seemed to sense the change in him. They continued with the drill, but there was a different energy in the air. Instead of rushing to get through the exercises, they took their time, moving with more precision and care. Jake watched as they worked, his eyes scanning their movements carefully but without the usual impatience. He didn't need to step in and correct them. They were doing it right, without his constant guidance. As the session ended, Jake walked over to the group. His soldiers gathered around, waiting for feedback. They expected him to be proud, maybe even give them praise for their improvement. But Jake didn't say anything right away. He simply looked at them, his gaze steady. "Good work," he said finally, his voice calm and measured. "Keep that focus. You don't need me to tell you how to do it. Just stay sharp and keep doing what you're doing." The soldiers exchanged looks. There was no applause or celebration, but there was a shared understanding between them. Jake wasn't going to constantly praise them, but he was giving them something far more valuable: trust. Trust that they knew what they were doing. Trust that they could handle the responsibility. And in turn, they trusted him more than ever. After the training, Jake sat alone in his office, reflecting on the day. He thought about how different things had become since he had changed his approach. The soldiers were performing better, more focused and disciplined, and Jake realized that he wasn't just leading them. He was teaching them how to lead themselves. He thought back to the Royal Guard once more. It wasn't just the stillness that had impressed him. It was the quiet strength that came with it. The guard didn't need to speak or move to make his presence felt. His silence commanded respect, and that was the kind of leadership Jake wanted to embody. The kind of strength that didn't come from loud words or big gestures, but from a quiet confidence that others could sense. Jake knew he still had a lot to learn, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't just leading with authority. He was leading with presence. And that, he realized, was the most powerful kind of leadership. Months had passed since Jake's experience in London, and he was now fully settled into his new role as a leader. His approach had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated, and as time went on, he saw the impact it had on his soldiers. The quiet discipline he had learned from the Royal Guard had become part of him. His presence, once loud and commanding, had transformed into something far more powerful, a steady, focused calm that gave his team the confidence to work together more effectively. It was early one morning when Jake stood at the edge of the training field, watching his team prepare for another drill. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden light across the field. The air was cool, and the sound of soldiers getting ready filled the quiet. As he observed them, Jake realized how far they had come. They had grown into a team that worked in harmony, trusting each other and themselves. He remembered the first day he had returned from London, how he had struggled to find his place with the new approach. He had wondered whether the calm leadership would work, whether the soldiers would respond to it. Now, as he watched them train without needing his constant supervision, he knew the answer. They didn't just need him to lead. They needed him to trust them, just as he had learned to trust himself. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts, and he turned to see one of his senior soldiers, Rick, walking up to him. Rick was one of the more experienced men on the team, and over time, he had become one of Jake's most trusted advisors. "Sir, everything's set for the drill," Rick said with a respectful nod. Jake nodded back, his voice calm as always. "Good. Let them move at their own pace. No rushing today." Rick looked at him for a moment, as if processing the request. "You sure? Usually we push them harder." "Today is about focus, not speed," Jake replied. "Let them take their time. We've been rushing too much. It's time they learn the value of precision." Rick smiled and gave a nod of approval. "Understood, sir. I'll make sure they know." As the drill began, Jake stood at the back of the field, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't need to say much. He could see how the soldiers were moving, how each one was focused on their task, how they were giving their best without being told. They weren't rushing to get through it. They were taking their time to do it right. Jake felt a sense of pride, but it wasn't the kind of pride that came from shouting orders or being the center of attention. It was the pride that came from watching his team succeed on their own, knowing he had helped guide them to this point. Later, as the drill ended, Jake gathered the team together. The air was filled with a quiet energy, and the soldiers looked at him expectantly. This time, there was no need for a long speech or dramatic words. Jake simply looked at them, his expression calm, and said, "Good job today. You've all shown what true discipline looks like. Keep this up." There was no applause, no loud cheers, but the soldiers stood a little taller, their respect for him evident in the way they held themselves. Jake knew that his journey wasn't over, that true leadership was a lifelong path, but he also knew that he had come a long way since that day in London. The lessons from the Royal Guard had not only shaped the way he led, but had also shaped the way his soldiers led themselves. As he walked off the field, Jake couldn't help but smile. He had learned the power of silence, the strength of stillness, and the true meaning of discipline. And now, he was ready to continue leading, not with loud commands, but with a quiet strength that would carry him and his team forward.